Go ahead and get started. So we are very lucky to have Alex and Cathy with us today. I think it's going to be really beneficial for all of us. Before I hand the mic over to them so they can introduce themselves, I'm just going to brag on them for a little bit. So they both have co-founded Mullen Memory, which is a nonprofit which provides free resources for exploring memory and learning tools. I would encourage you all to check it out. They have some really cool stuff on like how to memorize the facial nerve and all the parts of it and stuff like that. It's really neat. Alex is a 3-time world memory champion. He is the first American to win the world title and has won 3 years in a row. He is currently the #1 ranked memory competitor in the world. And as of December, he has held 7 world records in different disciplines. He was the first person to memorize the order of a deck of cards in under 20 seconds in an official competition. And also, on top of that, they're both M3s, which is a feat in itself. And we could probably spend an hour asking them questions about that. So I'm going to hand it over to him.
We're just going to play a little clip first.
But I need to know you in order to sell to you. That is why I have asked you to go around and tell me your names. I have an amazing mnemonic device by which I have now memorized all of your names. Shirty, Mole, Lazy Eye, Mexico, Baldy, Sugar Boobs, Black Woman. I have taken a unique part of who you are, and I have used that to memorize your name. Baldy. Your head is bald. It is hairless. It is shiny. It is reflective like a mirror. M, your name is Mark.
Yes.
Got it. It works.
Okay, that's it. So that is kind of relevant. Hopefully that'll make sense as we keep going. So my name is Alex, like he said, and then this is Cathy, and we're married, if that wasn't clear. And I would like to, just keep this pretty informal. So if you have any questions or anything, just go ahead and ask. We'll have, I guess, some time at the end for questions probably. It shouldn't take too long. We're not going to try to keep you guys here very long. Just kind of get through some basic stuff. And just ask any questions if you have them. So we're M3s. And like Kirby said, I've been doing memory competitions for the last couple of years. Just memorizing, things like the order of decks of playing cards, strings of numbers, names and faces, kind of dry stuff like that. And the truth is, though, that I really don't have a really naturally great memory. My normal average, my natural memory is quite average. But I use memory techniques to kind of do all those things. And all the other competitors and competitions use those same techniques also. And so, when we were kind of coming through med school the last couple of years, we wanted to try to apply those memory techniques to school. And it wasn't that easy necessarily, because a lot of the memory competitors will kind of talk about the techniques. They'll talk about something like the memory palace technique, which you might have heard of. But there's not a lot of information out there about actually applying it to learning in kind of a sustainable way that you could use to learn effectively. They'll just kind of give you a simple example. And we wanted to kind of take it a step further than that and actually use it to learn effectively. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So talk a little bit about memory tips first, and specifically the techniques we use, like the memory palace, just because that's kind of our specialty. And then Cathy's going to give an example a little bit after that, and then kind of at the end we'll try to integrate it into an approach that is kind of a more comprehensive learning strategy, and talk about a bit about some of the techniques that you can use to learn that are more evidence-based. So the things that learning research has said are effective, and then the techniques that aren't as effective. So I wanted to do like a quick demo first, just get a couple of people. We can. Which one? Yeah, that's actually easier. Okay, so just each person just give me 3 digits. So just say something like 193, something like that. So and try to remember your 3. So just start on the left right there. Okay. Yeah, single digits, 3 of them. 249, okay. You can keep going. 628, okay. 348, okay. 487, okay. 201, okay. 943. Okay. We can just keep going a couple more. Okay, so you said 766. Okay. 583. Okay. 583,317. Okay. All right, let me just think about it, review it for a quick second. You guys remember your numbers? Okay. So just, if you could all just put up your hands real quick, and then if I say your number correctly, you can just put it down. So, yeah, okay. So 735, okay, 249, 628, 348, 487, 201, 943, 766, 583, 317. Okay. That's good. I don't always get it right, so that's lucky. But I'll talk a little bit about how I just did that. So to do that, I used a technique called the memory palace. But just to kind of talk about memory techniques more generally, it's really just about trying to take whatever you're learning and give it some sort of meaning. You know what I mean? Because we learn a lot of abstract information in med school, a lot of abstract facts, and they're not necessarily very meaningful, right? They're just facts. And so, when memory competitors memorize things, they tend to take advantage of two things that humans are really naturally very good at. And that's visual memory and spatial memory. So, that kind of makes sense. It's not too hard to understand. When you give something a picture and associate it with kind of a mental image, that's inherently a lot more meaningful, right? So, it's just kind of a picture is 1,000 words, that kind of thing. And so that's one way of kind of tying something concrete to create a memory. So to give kind of an example of that really quick, you guys haven't had micro yet, but for instance in micro, there's this bug called ehrlichiosis, and ehrlichiosis is a bug that causes you to have berry inclusions in your white cells. Okay, so in your white cells, if you're affected with the bug ehrlichiosis, you can see berry inclusions. That's just kind of a random fact, right? And if you're memorizing hundreds of those facts, that's going to leak out pretty quickly. But what if, instead you imagined licking a berry? Okay, so you're licking a berry. And, the licking kind of encodes the ehrlichiosis part. So ehrlichiosis for licking, and then the berry for berry inclusion. So just remembering, licking that berry, that's a way of visualizing some images and tying those two things together so you remember that fact. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then the spatial part is a little less obvious, but if you really think about it, it makes a lot of sense. So, if you were to just kind of close your eyes for a second and imagine the place you live, so in your house, apartment, whatever, you can pretty easily think about that place. You can think about where your scissors are, or where your shoes are, or, where your towels are, and you can just kind of navigate through that place pretty well without even thinking about it. And that works pretty well for a lot of locations that you've been to. You could probably think back to your childhood elementary school and remember that place pretty well. Maybe not perfectly, but you'd remember it really well. And, that's just something that humans are naturally very good at. You didn't have to sit down and memorize all that stuff. You just kind of soak it up very, very naturally. And so, just kind of continuing off that ehrlichiosis berry inclusions example, how might we use, a location to help remember that information better? So, you can just imagine very simply, just imagine sitting on your front porch or in front of your house or apartment, and just imagine sitting there and licking the berry. Okay, so you've now added a location to this picture. And so you might wonder, why would we do that? Maybe licking the berry was perfectly fine to remember that fact. And, an easy answer to that is one that just kind of adds another hook. It adds another layer of context. And that just helps encode that memory and make it a little bit more powerful. And then the other is, you can imagine using this location to kind of have some organizational structure, and remember a sequence. So, if you had 4 or 5 facts you wanted to remember about ehrlichiosis that were kind of hard to remember, you could imagine just picking 4 or 5 different spots in your front yard or in the front of your house, and making images to represent those 4 or 5 facts. And so that kind of helps you group them together and keep a nice little set of organized images to remember those facts. So hopefully that kind of makes sense so far. And, that really brings us to the idea of a memory palace, which I've been mentioning but not really explaining, which is essentially a location that you imagine in your mind's eye, a location that you know pretty well, you're familiar with it, like your house, and you just think of different spots in that place and turn the information you want to remember into mental images, and then deposit those images on those spots. And that kind of helps really encode the information in a way that humans are really naturally very good at. Like I said, my memory's not really that good, but I can do a lot of kind of interesting stuff by using this memory palace technique. And, just to kind of be clear, we aren't necessarily memorizing every little thing we come across willy-nilly. We don't just go through the entire book and memorize every little fact about everything. We really focus on those things that are tricky to remember, or, maybe you miss a question on a test and you think, oh, this little list I have to know that they're obviously quizzing about is hard to remember. Maybe I'll just make a couple of images in a memory palace to help remember those things. So that's, incredibly helpful. And then the other important thing is that, you can really get a lot of good retention with just a couple of reviews of that material. If you review your images in your memory palace, it can really stick a lot longer in your long-term memory than it might otherwise would. So, we made a lot of images our first and second years, and then we took a year off actually to focus on, teaching some memory techniques and stuff like that. And we're now constantly referencing a lot of those images, and they're still pretty strong. So it's, you kind of get a little bit kind of zeroed in, taking, test after test after test. But, if you really think about it, you're going to want to remember this stuff, years down the road, and just kind of cramming it is not necessarily the most effective way. And so this can help you kind of improve that. So that was my little spiel about memory palaces, and Cathy's going to give an example real quick.
So Kirby told us that y'all are learning endocrine now for phys, and y'all just finished renal. So we thought, did y'all already have your insulin lecture? You just did. Awesome. So we thought that we would go ahead and do kind of like a mini palace here in this room about stuff that increases insulin secretion. And one thing that Alex kind of mentioned, but I always like to tell people is, it might seem like a lot of time to do this, but it actually lasts a really long time. And I think that a lot of people are actually already using this technique instinctively. If you find yourself taking a test and then you roll your eyes back and you're like, oh my gosh, I can see it. It's the top left corner of my notes, and it's in this color, and it looks like this. And so that's what you're already doing, is the spatial memory of it. So this is just a more powerful way of doing it. So the things that increase insulin secretion, you have several categories. Your first category is your gastric hormones. Okay. Yeah, that's true. Okay. He has the better memory. So obviously, if you have glucose in your blood, you're going to have increased insulin production, but we're not going to encode that because it's pretty obvious. We're going to start with the stuff that's not so obvious. So the first one that I'm going to encode are the gastric hormones. So the first one is gastric inhibitory peptide. So for me, people write that as GIP. For me, when I think of GIP, the very first thing that pops in my mind is a GIP. So let's take this space right here, this little dark corner, and let's just imagine there's a GI soldier peeing in the corner for GIP. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so just really kind of think of the first things that pop in your mind. Has someone done that before? Okay, so the next one is glucagon-like polypeptide 1. So GLP-1 or GLP-1. So the first thing that popped in my mind when I heard that was lip gloss, like lip gloss, but lip gloss. So let's imagine Wilson is a total valley girl, and she says like all the time. So we'll have Wilson over here putting on some lip gloss going like glucagon like polypeptide 1. Okay, so now our next section are the autonomics. So you have your alpha-2 receptor, and that also downregulates it. So we kind of put this one in here just to kind of show you that you can use it to differentiate between things. You might see beta-2 and alpha-2 on a test and kind of get them confused. So we'll put beta-2 up on this projector and alpha-2 down on the bottom. Beta-2 upregulates insulin. Alpha-2 downregulates it. So when I hear beta-2, I think of like fishing bait. So just imagine you're sitting up here on this projector screen, just having a great day, throwing out your bait to the fish, beta-2. That upregulates your insulin. And then down here, we'll have 2 tiny little alpha dogs hiding under the table, and they're scared and they're downregulated. So your 2 alpha-2s downregulate insulin. Yeah? Okay. And then we have our hormones. So we'll put them over here, cortisol and growth hormone. So when I hear cortisol, the first thing I think of is the quartz. So like a little, gavel. Yeah. And then growth hormone, I think of just like a big bodybuilder. He wants to get bigger. So we'll just have like a huge growth hormone bodybuilder slamming a gavel. He might even break this podium because he's so strong. Okay. Does that kind of make sense how it works? So I'll let y'all do the last 4. These are the amino acids that upregulate insulin. Let's do the first one. The first one's arginine. Y'all just call out R. Okay, that's good. That's actually the one that I thought of. Okay, good. And lysine. Lice? Did someone say lice? Okay, that's what I thought of too. So why don't we imagine a pirate running down this path right here, scratching himself all over, going, the lice. Okay. And then the last 2 are leucine. So what do you think of when you think of leucine? This sure is loose on the pirate. Okay, that's great. You could put the image also on the pirate. I heard I Love Lucy somewhere here. Do y'all know Lucille Ball? Okay, so we could have Lucy. And then the last one is alanine. What do y'all think about that? Okay, so clearly all of you are really good. You can pop up with things that just come right to your mind. So whatever works for you, you'll work. So I thought of I Love Lucy, and I thought of an Allen Ranch, but we could do alligator, right? So you can have Lucille Ball sitting up here. She's trying to get away from an alligator that's snapping at her from down here. So Lucille Ball, alligator. Okay? So those are it. That's it. And, some of that is like pretty intuitive. And that's the thing about phys. We were talking last night about stuff you want to memorize for phys. The thing is, the things on that list that I just made should make sense to you, but not everything that makes sense will be on that list. Right? That's how I felt the whole time during phys. Like, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then I would forget what was actually on the list. So does anybody want to try running through that palace we just made? Yeah? Okay. What's your name? Alex? Okay.
So the GI peen in the corner, Wilson, lip gloss glip. You've got the alpha dog hiding under the table, the beta, the fishing, casting out the bait, the alligator, or the pirate running down with lice in his hair, and then the alligator with Lucille Ball. Oh, and then the growth hormone for the big guy with the gavel, so cortisol.
Very good. Thank you. You don't want me to go over the stuff?
I would.
Okay.
So, just to kind of reiterate, hopefully it's clear now, but you can imagine, learning that stuff initially, and maybe you thought you kind of had it, and then you do a question, and it's, essentially asking what causes insulin to go up in this case, and the answer was leucine or something like that, and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that list, but it's kind of long and kind of messy. Maybe an acronym, which we use a lot of, because they're just another way of giving meaning to stuff. But maybe an acronym didn't really work well for this list, you might expect. So, that's a kind of a good example of when you might actually make some images to kind of help remember this particular list. Yeah, what's up? It really just depends on your personal preference. So, what I do is I just kind of work with whatever amount of space feels comfortable. So if I can kind of encode everything I want in this one room and it doesn't feel cramped or it doesn't feel way too spread out, then I'll just kind of reserve this one room for that information. Yeah, and so I don't usually overwrite images. If I pick a place to use for a particular topic, I'll always kind of refer to that one place for that topic and nothing else. Does that make sense? Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the way that I do it is I basically just have kind of a running Excel doc that I've compiled over the years, where I've just kind of written down any possible place I can think of that I've been. So, it could be houses, places I've lived, schools I've been to, movie theaters, libraries, whatever, restaurants, it could just be anything, and I'll just pick a place to use. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, as we got more comfortable using it initially, we were a little bit more kind of freewheeling with it. It's tempting, like as a beginner, to be like, oh, I'm going to use this very rigid thing, and I'm going to start with my house, and everything is going to be in the house. But eventually, you just kind of just start making associations, and it just kind of helps in general, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't really know if I really talked about. We'll get to talking about review in just a second, but generally, no, it's okay. Generally, if you want to remember something more long term, you're going to have to review it a few times. So if I didn't really come back to that, I probably wouldn't remember most of it. Like I remember it right now, and I'd probably remember it like for the next couple hours or so. But if I wanted to remember it long term, which I don't, then I would go back and review it. Yeah. I have a system where I basically have a predetermined image for every set of 3 digits. So the first one was 735. So my image for 735 every time is Kumail Nanjiani from anybody Silicon Valley fans? Anyone? So he's just this guy, right? And so I started at the front of that library and imagined him there, and then just kind of did that same process for the rest of the images. Yep. Yeah, so there's 1,000. Yeah. Yeah, so that took some time, right? And that's kind of why, if you're competing a lot, you do
Okay, but you don't have to be that crazy to use memory palaces. That's why I'm here to tell you, like, you can be normal and use it, too. I'm serious. Even my mom uses it. So, and y'all asked some good questions, and that's, like, the last thing we wanted to end on, which is, like, we sometimes get emails from people who say, this is exhausting, we're spending so much time on this, and it's not really working, I'm not remembering everything. And that's because it's good, but it's not sufficient. And so we always try to emphasize, it's a great technique to use in addition to other learning strategies. And Alex and I recently wrote a section in the 2018 First Aid, so you can go check it out in the first chapter if you want to see like our full spiel on it. But yeah, it's called Effective Learning Strategies. Basically, we reviewed the evidence out there to see what actually works, especially for people like us who take a lot of tests all the time. And I'll just kind of tell you guys the first 3. I'll just say it. We don't have to write it. You want me to write it? Okay. I'll just tell you the top 3, and then if you want more details, you can go read the book. The top 3 are practice tests. So doing a lot of practice tests. Second one, spaced repetition. So giving yourself time between when you see it and review it. And the third one is called interleaving. So instead of just sitting down and being like, I'm only going to do cardiology today, and then tomorrow I'm only going to do like nephrology, kind of space, interweaving all the different topics. Yep, that's basically it. Do interleave. Yeah. So it's called interleaving, interleave. And it's kind of the opposite of just chunking your information.
And so just to kind of like summarize a little bit, all of those strategies are pretty much effective because they emphasize active retrieval. So any strategy that you use where you're like actively thinking and trying to retrieve a piece of information that you learned from memory is going to be more effective. Okay, so there's active strategies which tend to be good, passive strategies tend to be bad. That obviously makes sense, but one thing that I think confuses people sometimes is they think of testing themselves as just a way of sort of seeing what they know, and just saying, oh, at this particular time, I know this amount of information. But it's actually a lot more than that. The process of retrieving it actively directly strengthens the memory in a very effective way. So just that active process of retrieving it actually increases the length of that memory by a lot. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So that's really why a lot of these strategies are more effective. And so you can imagine, some of the more passive strategies like rereading your notes, which, not very active, kind of passive. That's something that tons of people do. It's probably the most common learning strategy that people use, and it's pretty ineffective, especially when you compare it, to strategies like this, if you just learn something for the first time and then go back and test yourself on that information without rereading it versus rereading it, you're going to remember it a lot longer in general. So rereading, not so good. Another one is highlighting. So that's another thing that people do a ton. Not a lot of evidence that highlighting is very effective. Again, it's pretty passive, not a lot of active retrieval there. And the last one is summarization. And, summarization was something that I did a lot as an undergrad. And I found it kind of effective, partly because I was doing more, like I was an engineering major, and so I had more math and stuff like that. But what kind of the literature shows is that when you're taking lots of multiple choice tests, which we are in medicine, that tends to not be as effective. So if we did free response tests, maybe it would be more effective. In general, for multiple choice tests, summarization is not necessarily a great tool. So rereading, highlighting, summarization, not as effective as practice testing, which really should be your number one strategy. The bulk of your time should be spent doing practice testing. Spaced repetition or distributed practice is another way, just kind of spacing things out, not cramming. And then interleaving is also kind of an interesting one that's not necessarily as intuitive. For instance, when you do a practice block, mixing up the types of questions instead of doing all cardiology questions or all, whatever type of questions. I think that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all we have. There's a lot more obviously to get into. We just kind of scratched the surface. If you wanted to kind of see more about memory techniques or just, what we've kind of written or put on the internet about learning strategies, you can go to our website, like Kirby mentioned. It's just Mullen Memory. So our last name and then memory. .com, and there's some videos and stuff on there. We also kind of, like Cathy mentioned, we wrote it's like a 3 or 4 page section of First Aid 2018 that if you kind of are interested in learning strategies, you might want to check out. And that's pretty much it. We can field some questions if you guys have more questions. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you
So we both use Anki. So I'm sure you guys have heard of Anki. It's becoming a lot more popular among med students. So we do use Anki. For anyone who doesn't know, is like a flashcard. It's like a digital flashcard thing you do on your computer. It uses spaced repetition software. So you make a flashcard, and then it will automatically, send that card back to you in, 4 or 5 days or whatever. And so you don't have to think about planning out your reviews at all. So that's very helpful. And it also kind of takes advantage of the whole active retrieval thing, because if you make a question and answer flashcard, you're actively retrieving it and not just rereading. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That has an added benefit in clinical practice, which we've noticed this year, where like if you're trying to search, I rarely search for arginine in my palace, right? You don't actually need to know that stuff. But well, I guess you do, but just for a more real life example, if I'm like, hey, what's your favorite pizza place in all the places that you lived? It's really easy to think about all the pizza places you've ever been to. You can think about what your favorite pizza was from that place. And so in clinic, when we're on rotations, if I'm trying to think of insulin, I can think of all the places I've seen metformin, which is an insulin, is a diabetic drug. So, using the same image allows you to kind of search through it quickly, the same way you would search for pizza restaurants in your memory.
Other questions? Yeah. Cathy can talk more about this. The main way I personally incorporate interleaving is when I do a question block, I'll make sure to mix in questions from lots of topics together. That's what I think of mainly, but Cathy has maybe a different opinion.
That's the way I do it, but I actually just read a paper the other day about that, and they polled the students who they had to do it the way you said, with just an hour, like you force yourself to stop, and the other group chunked it, and the group that forced themselves to stop, they felt like they knew it less, like they felt kind of shaky on it, but they actually learned it better. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, I've never felt like I've been good at memorizing things, but I started when I was a junior in college. I read this book, which, if you're interested, you can check out, called Moonwalking with Einstein. So you can imagine moonwalking with Einstein. That's a visual image. And then I read that book, and I started to the author did the competitions himself in the book. And so I was like, that's kind of interesting, but I just wanted to learn about the techniques for school. But I started to kind of practice like cards and numbers and stuff. And like I said, was not very good at it at the beginning, but for some reason I just kind of got hooked on it and hooked on practicing it and started to improve. And then after a year or two, I was kind of competing on a national level or so. And then just kind of kept going from there. Yeah. Yeah. Say that again. Okay. Yeah, so the kind of stupid answer is think about trying Anki for the first time. The other answer is I would just, well, one easy way is like you guys really haven't used UWorld yet, which is just a question bank. But, in UWorld, you can just mark questions that you're not sure about. And then, a week later, when you're doing more practice questions, you just kind of come back to those. And that's an easy way of just sort of spacing it a little bit. The bulk of my practice is still just doing practice questions. So if you're consistently doing practice questions, that material is going to come back.
I do have something to say. I don't know if it's better, but one thing that like people talk about, especially, even younger children can do this with a palace, is now when you go home, think about this lecture hall and then just walk through it like we did today and then kind of review it and say, okay, Wilson, GLP-1, why does that make sense? And that's not a flashcard, but you're still kind of actively retrieving it. And I know that people say, we can even do this with elementary school kids because it gives you that instant feedback on like, do I remember it? Why do I remember it? Does it make sense? So if you don't like flashcards, that might work.
You're essentially asking, like, did we use a lot of images with Anki together? Yeah, so like when I make Anki cards and I want to make images for the information on the card, I have just kind of manually added an extra field to the Anki card, and I'll write in my little mnemonic for that card. That's basically it. So for a lot of my cards, I have images written on them, and I'll just kind of use that when I'm recalling that information. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's really the way that I do it, is just kind of using Anki to help figure out what I don't know, because if I'm missing that card a lot, it'll just bring it back in front of me mostly. Do you have anything you want to add about that? Yeah, that's just my personal way, is kind of using Anki to do that for me. Mm-hmm.
A really long list.
So one thing you could do is, like, if you were using flashcards, you could sort of split those up and review them separately. And so, if there's one that you tend to forget more often, it'll come back more often when you miss it. Does that make sense? The other is the other thing that comes to my mind is just to maybe adjust the image. If you are, continually forgetting it, you could just kind of think of a different image or just sort of add a tweak to it to make it stand out a little bit more. But it's true. Sometimes you just kind of forget stuff. I don't really have a magic solution for that.
Just review it, because Alex did it without any review, So once you review it, it'll stick.
Right.
Do you want to take? If y'all have any more questions, you can feel free to email us. My email is chichen@umc.edu, and his is amullen@umc.edu, or you can go there. But unless we have any more questions, I don't want to take up y'all's lunchtime on a Friday. Do you? So histo was so early for us that we were still trying to figure out how to use this. There really isn't. There's a lot of hokey stuff out there, like use memory techniques, improve your mind in 2 weeks, and be smart forever. And all of that stuff is hokey. So that's why we took the year off and did the website. But when we were learning histo, we didn't. Y'all are doing female reproductive stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anything you can think of to kind of make it more concrete or meaningful, like I've been saying, is helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a $1 million question.
Still kind of figuring it out. We both like radiology and we both like peds. Still kind of figuring it out though. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately for y'all, the kind of nice thing about these techniques is because they're mainly useful for lists of things or facts that are hard to remember. There's more stuff in the second year that it's helpful with. So a lot of the stuff that we use it for is pharm, which is very memorization heavy, obviously, and micro. Those and then path too. So kind of all the second year courses tend to be what we use it more for. But you can use it here and there for different things. For instance, sometimes. So if it's an image that I kind of struggle with, like Kirby mentioned that there's a video on our website about memorizing the facial nerve, and so I'm just kind of trying to talk through using a memory palace to memorize that schematic. It's just a picture of it. And so for that particular example, I don't always do it for every image, but when I'm having trouble, I might pick a palace that I'll try to make in my mind kind of look like the schematic or like the image. And so maybe I'll put, a couple of images on the left side of the palace, if they're representing information on the left side of the image, and to kind of make it look the same. I would recommend, if you're really interested, I'd recommend watching that video just because it makes it a little bit more clear. I can't get into a full example, but yeah.
It's fun. It's fun to do.
Yeah, you just think of whatever you want to think of, and if it's silly or kind of raunchy or whatever, it can be helpful. So like I said, I started in the front of my college library. So I'm imagining Kumail, which is a 735, eating like a PB&J sandwich, 249, and then the next place it's like kind of up on a railing. I imagine Jennifer Aniston, who's 628. You guys remember these numbers? 628, and she's basically getting slapped by my high school principal. He's 348, and then I kind of moved to the next one, and my next one is 487. That's a passport, and so I can't make it super specific in terms of describing all the locations, but it's a passport, and then there's a nest for 201, which is the next one. Kind of just crunched inside the passport. And then there's a pyramid, and I kind of moved the nest to the next one, and there's a pyramid being built inside the nest. That's 943. And then the next one is 766, which is a quiche for me. So I'm just imagining a tiny quiche like sitting on top of this pyramid. And then the next one is 583. And then, so on top of the quiche, which I moved to the next spot in the memory palace, I imagine like a little stink bug and just like smashing the stink bug into the quiche, and now it's like smelly and nasty. And then the last one is 317. And for me, that image is Morgan Tukers from the Mindy Project. So he's just like looking at this, quiche and being like, that looks good. That's it. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you guys. Thanks for having us.
Make your computer easy.